In the opening months of 1942, the Eastern Front had already become a place where men disappeared faster than they could be replaced. Near Leningrad, German reconnaissance units were ordered into frozen forests that maps barely described and officers barely understood. Patrols went in with radios, rifles, and confidence. Some never came back. Others returned missing men, shaken, unable to explain what had happened. There were no firefights, no enemy assaults, no artillery strikes, just silence, followed later by bodies found in the snow, each with a single, precise wound. German intelligence initially assumed they were facing a specialized Soviet unit, perhaps commandos trained in Moscow or a newly formed sniper detachment equipped with advanced optics. Reports were filed, theories drafted, countermeasures planned. None of them matched reality. The man responsible had never attended a military academy. He had never studied tactics from manuals or trained on parade grounds. Before the war, he had spent his life alone, moving slowly through forests, watching animals that survived only by sensing danger before it appeared. As weeks passed, the numbers became impossible to ignore. Dozens turned into hundreds. Officers altered patrol routes, delayed movements, and increased escorts. Yet the deaths continued. What frightened the Germans most was not the efficiency of the killings, but the absence of patterns. There was no fixed position, no predictable rhythm, no behavior that fit traditional military logic. The shooter did not defend territory. He did not hold ground. He appeared, killed, and vanished, leaving behind only uncertainty. What the German command failed to understand was that they were not being fought by a soldier in the conventional sense. They were being hunted. The man in the forest was not thinking in terms of objectives or orders. He was thinking in terms of patience, terrain, and timing. He knew where men would slow down, where they would expose themselves without realizing it, and how long he could wait without moving. Long before the war reached him, he had learned that survival depended on remaining unseen, unheard, and unnecessary to notice until it was too late. This was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself across the war. Again and again, the most lethal snipers would emerge, not from elite units, but from rural backgrounds where men grew up understanding land, weather, and silence. The battlefield simply became another hunting ground, and the enemy, another form of prey that made predictable mistakes when fear and exhaustion set in. As winter deepened, the German response followed familiar military logic. More men were assigned to patrols, better rifles were issued. Orders emphasized tighter formations and quicker movement. Officers believed discipline and numbers would solve the problem. Instead, the forest began claiming lives faster. Columns moving through snow-packed trails became slower, louder, more predictable. Every adjustment made them easier to read for someone who had grown up reading forests the way others read streets. The sniper did not rush. He never chased opportunities. He waited for mistakes. German soldiers, trained for maneuver warfare and rapid advances, were now forced into an environment that punished speed and rewarded stillness. Frost numbed fingers. Breath betrayed position. Boots compressed snow with a sound that carried far in cold air. Each man focused on staying warm, staying upright, staying awake. That distraction alone was enough. Military training taught soldiers to look for enemies who behaved like soldiers. They scanned tree lines at eye level. They searched for trenches, muzzle flashes, movement that matched doctrine. What they missed was the man who had learned to lie motionless for hours while hunting animals that could hear a heartbeat through the snow. He did not think in minutes or hours. He thought in daylight cycles, wind shifts, and temperature changes. Waiting was not discomfort to him. It was habit. As casualties mounted, German units began rotating fresh troops into the sector, assuming exhaustion was the cause of failure. The deaths continued unchanged. New men made the same errors as the old ones. They paused at the same clearings. They stood upright at the same map checks. They exposed officers first, because officers behaved differently without realizing it. better posture, longer pauses, a fraction of a second too confident. The real advantage was not marksmanship, though the shooting was precise. It was familiarity. The sniper knew how long snow stayed frozen after sunrise. He knew which patches softened first under sunlight. He knew where sound carried and where it died. He chose firing positions not for visibility, but for invisibility after the shot. The bullet mattered less than what happened next. Survival depended on never being found twice. German countersnipers eventually entered the area, men with scopes and formal training. They searched methodically, establishing overwatch positions and scanning from elevated points. To them, height meant advantage. To a hunter, height meant exposure. Sunlight glinted off lenses, breath condensed in small white clouds. The forest answered those mistakes immediately. What no report could properly explain was why this kind of sniper kept surviving. Conventional snipers were tied to doctrine. They were assigned sectors, schedules, relief times. They defended positions. Hunters did none of that. They did not return to the same place. They did not protect ground. They protected themselves. The kill was only a byproduct of patience, not the objective. By late winter, fear replaced strategy. Patrols hesitated before moving. Men rushed when they should have slowed down. Silence became threatening. Every tree line felt occupied. The sniper had altered behavior without ever being seen. That psychological shift mattered as much as the bodies. Soldiers who expect contact behave cautiously. Soldiers who expect invisible death make errors. This pattern would repeat itself across the war, from the frozen north to ruined cities and forests across Eastern Europe. Again and again, men with rural backgrounds would outperform trained professionals, not because they were braver or stronger, but because they understood something doctrine never taught. War, stripped of formations and orders, was still governed by the same rules as hunting. Those who understood the environment survived. Those who tried to dominate it did not. As the war expanded, the phenomenon that began near Leningrad revealed itself on a much larger scale. Across the Eastern Front and in the frozen north, armies began encountering snipers whose effectiveness defied conventional explanation. They did not behave like specialists trained in classrooms or firing ranges. They behaved like men who had lived their entire lives learning how not to be noticed. And almost without exception, their backgrounds followed the same pattern. They came from villages, far from cities, from places where winter was not an event but a condition of life. Siberian shepherds, Finnish farmers, Yakut hunters, Caucasian mountaineers, men who had grown up tracking animals for food, not sport. For them, patience was not a virtue taught by discipline. It was a necessity learned through hunger. Move too early and the animal escapes. Make noise and the day is wasted. Miss once and you do not eat. When these men entered the army, the battlefield did not feel alien. The uniforms changed, the targets changed, but the fundamentals remained the same. Terrain still dictated movement. Weather still decided who suffered first. Fear still caused predictable behavior. Soldiers under stress paused, rushed, clustered, and exposed themselves in the same ways wounded animals did. Hunters recognized those patterns instantly. Military snipers were taught tactics. Rural snipers relied on instinct, sharpened by repetition. They did not measure success by how many shots they fired, but by how few were needed. Many of them rejected equipment considered essential by doctrine. Telescopic sights reflected light. Complex mechanisms failed in cold or mud. Simpler tools were quieter, more reliable, and familiar. What mattered was not technology, but control. The difference became most visible in survival rates. Sniping was one of the deadliest roles in the war. 3 out of 4 trained snipers were killed, wounded, or captured. Yet the deadliest among them survived at far higher rates. They did not survive because they were luckier. They survived because they treated the battlefield as temporary and hostile, never something to be held or defended. They did not wait for orders to move. They moved when it felt wrong to stay. One Soviet sniper later explained that the moment after a kill was more dangerous than the shot itself. Military doctrine focused on firing solutions. Hunters focused on escape. The shot was only the midpoint. What mattered was where you would be 30 seconds later, and whether anyone could guess where you had been. These men planned their exits before they planned their shots. As their kill counts rose, they were studied, praised, and sometimes mythologized. Propaganda departments turned them into symbols. But propaganda misunderstood them. It framed their success as heroism or patriotism. In reality, their effectiveness came from detachment. They did not hate the enemy. They did not rush to prove anything. They waited, observed, and acted only when conditions were perfect. This was the secret hidden behind the numbers. The war rewarded those who could disappear more than those who could advance. The men who survived longest were not the ones who mastered doctrine, but the ones who understood that survival came first. Killing was secondary. And in a war where most snipers died young, that distinction made all the difference. By the time High Command began to notice the pattern, it was already too late to reverse it. Reports from multiple fronts showed the same uncomfortable truth. The most lethal snipers were not the ones produced by formal training programs, and they were not behaving the way doctrine expected. They operated alone more often, ignored prescribed firing positions, and abandoned areas without orders. To officers trained to think in terms of control and coordination, this looked like undisciplined behavior. In reality, it was the reason they stayed alive. Armies tried to systematize what could not be easily systematized. Sniper schools expanded, manuals were rewritten, thousands of soldiers were trained to shoot accurately at long range. But accuracy was never the rare skill. Survival was. Many newly trained snipers learned how to hit a target. Few learned how to leave without being tracked. Fewer still learned when not to shoot at all. The rural snipers understood that every action left a trace. Footprints, disturbed snow, broken vegetation, spent casings, even patterns of silence. They minimized all of it. They approached positions indirectly. They waited longer than seemed reasonable. They accepted entire days without firing a shot because the conditions were wrong. To a command structure counting kills, this looked inefficient. To a hunter, it was normal. One mistake separated professionals from predators. Military snipers often remained in an area until ordered to move or relieved. Hunters moved when the environment changed, not when time passed. A shift in wind, a change in light, a sound that did not belong. These were signals that mattered more than any schedule. Staying too long meant being found. Being found meant dying. When counter-sniper teams were deployed, they relied on logic and symmetry. If a shot came from one direction, they searched likely vantage points. If a pattern appeared, they anticipated repetition. But the men they hunted did not repeat themselves. They avoided patterns deliberately. They understood that humans search for meaning and structure under stress, so they offered none. This forced enemy units into overreaction. Artillery was called in on entire sectors. Forests were saturated with fire. Buildings were leveled without confirmation of targets. These measures destroyed terrain but rarely eliminated the sniper. A hunter did not cling to a place. He abandoned it long before it became dangerous. Heavy fire, meant to solve the problem, often confirmed his success. It meant fear had reached command level. The psychological effect extended beyond casualties. Soldiers began to behave differently even when no sniper was present. Movements slowed. Reconnaissance hesitated. Leaders avoided exposed positions. Decision-making suffered. An unseen threat altered behavior more effectively than visible force. This was something no training manual addressed, yet it shaped entire sectors of the front. In the end, armies learned the wrong lesson. They focused on numbers, equipment, and training pipelines. What they could not replicate was a lifetime of experience in patience and self-reliance. You could teach a man to shoot in months. You could not teach him to think like a predator under fire. That mindset was forged long before the war began. The battlefield rewarded those who blended into it completely. The men who survived longest were not the bravest or the most aggressive. They were the ones who understood when to act and, more importantly, when to disappear. In a war that consumed millions, that understanding was the difference between becoming a statistic and becoming a ghost. By the final years of the war, the outcome of this silent contest was impossible to ignore. When historians later compared records, a disturbing pattern emerged. Snipers, trained through formal military pipelines, died at staggering rates. Many never survived long enough to accumulate significant kill counts. Yet the men who became legends, the ones whose numbers reached into the hundreds, often lived through the war and returned home quietly, carrying wounds but not graves. The explanation was never found in rifles or scopes, it was found in restraint. These men did not measure success by how many enemies they killed in a day, but by whether they were still alive the next morning. Their mindset treated every shot as a risk, not an achievement. If the conditions were imperfect, they simply did not fire. Hunger, cold, boredom, and pressure from command never pushed them into reckless action. When the war ended, many of these snipers disappeared from history almost as completely as they had disappeared on the battlefield. Some died before they could be celebrated. Others were ignored because they did not fit propaganda needs. A few were elevated as symbols, but even they rejected the attention. They returned to farms, forests, and villages. They raised animals, worked land, and spoke little of what they had done. To them, survival was not something to boast about. It was simply proof that their instincts had been correct. Decades later, military analysts studying sniper warfare reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The deadliest snipers were not exceptional because of aggression or bravery. They were exceptional because they understood limits. They knew when to stop. They knew when to wait. They knew that the environment always had the final vote. Doctrine could be rewritten, equipment could be upgraded, but no system could fully replace a lifetime of learning how not to be seen. The hook that began with vanished patrols and unexplained deaths leads to a simple truth. War did not turn these men into predators. They entered the war already thinking that way. The battlefield merely rewarded what they already knew. While others tried to impose control through firepower and movement, they allowed the environment to do the work for them. That was the secret that kept them alive while others died. Not superior training, not better technology, but an understanding that survival comes from patience, restraint, and invisibility. In a war defined by noise and destruction, the deadliest men were the ones who knew how to wait in silence, trust the land, and let their enemy make the final mistake. The story of the deadliest snipers of World War II leaves behind more than statistics and battlefield legends. Beneath the kill counts and frozen landscapes lies a set of lessons that extend far beyond warfare. These lessons are uncomfortable, often counterintuitive, and deeply human. They challenge modern assumptions about training, technology, discipline, and what it truly means to survive in extreme environments. The first and most fundamental lesson is that effectiveness does not begin with instruction, it begins with mindset. The men who dominated sniper warfare were not shaped primarily by military schools, manuals, or doctrine. They were shaped long before the war by environments that punished impatience and rewarded observation. Rural life taught them something formal systems rarely do. Consequences are immediate and unforgiving. When you hunt to eat, mistakes are not corrected by instructors or repeated drills. They result in hunger. That reality creates a mental discipline far stronger than enforced obedience. Modern institutions often assume that skill can be manufactured quickly if the curriculum is correct. World War II proved that some forms of competence resist rapid production. You can teach marksmanship in weeks. You can teach camouflage techniques and range estimation. But you cannot compress a lifetime of learning how to remain still, how to wait without reassurance, and how to accept inactivity as progress. Those traits are cultivated through experience, not instruction. Another lesson, lies in the difference between action and restraint. Military culture often glorifies aggression, decisiveness, and constant movement. Yet, the most successful snipers were defined by what they refused to do. They refused to fire when conditions were imperfect. They refused to remain in position simply because they had been assigned. They refused to chase targets or confirm kills. Their discipline was not expressed through obedience, but through denial of impulse. This challenges a deeply ingrained belief that success comes from doing more. In reality, their survival depended on doing less. Less movement, less exposure, less noise, less firing. Each restraint reduced risk. Each moment of patience compounded advantage. In high-risk environments, restraint is not hesitation. It is strategy. The third lesson is the primacy of environment over doctrine. Modern warfare tends to frame battles in terms of weapons, units, and objectives. These snipers understood something more basic. The environment is not a backdrop. It is an active participant. Snow absorbs sound. Cold reveals breath. Forests channel movement. Urban ruins create predictable cover. Those who learned to read these factors did not fight against them. They aligned with them. This lesson applies far beyond combat. In any competitive or high-stakes situation, ignoring context leads to failure. Systems, markets, organizations, and even human relationships operate within environments that shape behavior. Those who insist on imposing rigid frameworks often lose to those who adapt quietly and continuously. Flexibility grounded in observation consistently outperforms rigid planning. Another crucial lesson concerns patterns. Humans seek structure under stress. We look for repetition, routines, and predictability because they provide psychological comfort. Counter-sniper units failed repeatedly because they assumed their enemy would behave logically within established frameworks. The hunters exploited this tendency by refusing patterns. They rotated positions unpredictably. They changed routines. They denied symmetry. The broader lesson is that predictability is vulnerability. Systems that rely on repetition become easy to anticipate. Whether in warfare, business, or personal behavior, patterns invite exploitation. Survival favors those who deliberately disrupt their own routines when circumstances demand it. There is also a lesson about ownership versus control. Military snipers were often assigned sectors. Hunters owned terrain. Ownership implies intimacy. It means knowing not just where something is, but how it behaves under different conditions. The rural snipers knew how light moved through trees at different hours. They knew where sound traveled. They knew which paths men instinctively chose. Ownership cannot be granted through authority. It is earned through time and familiarity. In organizations, leaders often attempt to control systems they barely understand. Those closest to the ground often possess knowledge far more valuable than formal oversight. Ignoring that knowledge is costly. The survival rates of these snipers also reveal a lesson about ego. Many military snipers died because they stayed too long, fired too often, or tried to achieve recognition. Hunters had no interest in being seen. Their goal was not validation. It was survival. Ego drives exposure. Humility preserves life. This lesson is uncomfortable in cultures that reward visibility and recognition. The war demonstrated that being effective does not require being noticed. In fact, being noticed often signals failure. Quiet competence outlasts loud performance. Another lesson lies in the nature of fear. Conventional weapons create visible danger. Artillery announces itself. Gunfire reveals position. Snipers operating invisibly weaponized uncertainty. Fear of the unseen proved more destructive than fear of force. Units altered behavior, even in the absence of confirmed threats. This illustrates a powerful psychological principle. Uncertainty amplifies fear. Predictable threats can be managed. Invisible ones reshape behavior entirely. This principle appears everywhere, from deterrent strategies to competitive markets. Perception often matters more than action. The war also exposes the limits of technology. Telescopic sights, advanced rifles, and precision equipment did not guarantee success. In some cases, they increased vulnerability. Complexity failed in extreme conditions. Simplicity endured. This lesson remains relevant in a world obsessed with technological solutions. Tools amplify capability only when they align with conditions and human limitations. When they introduce fragility, they become liabilities. Robust systems prioritize reliability over sophistication. Another critical lesson concerns learning and feedback. Hunters learned directly from outcomes. Misses meant no food. Noise meant failure. Military systems often buffered feedback through hierarchy and delayed reporting. This created a disconnect between action and consequence. Organizations that separate decision makers from consequences tend to repeat errors. Systems that provide immediate, honest feedback foster adaptation. The sniper's effectiveness was inseparable from their feedback loop. The way these men were remembered also offers a lesson about history and recognition. Many of the most effective snipers were forgotten because they died early, belonged to minority groups, or did not fit propaganda narratives. Survivors were selectively elevated. This reminds us that history is not a neutral record. It is shaped by power, narrative needs, and bias. What is remembered is not always what mattered most. Understanding the past requires skepticism toward simplified stories. There is also a lesson about resilience. These men operated in conditions that broke others, physically and mentally. Cold, isolation, hunger, and constant danger did not overwhelm them because they had already endured hardship before the war. Comfort does not prepare people for crisis. Exposure does. This does not mean suffering should be glorified. It means that resilience is built through gradual adaptation, not sudden immersion. Systems that shield individuals from all discomfort often produce fragility rather than strength. Another lesson lies in decision-making under pressure. Hunters learned to trust judgment developed over time, rather than rigid rules. They adapted moment to moment. Military snipers constrained by doctrine often hesitated or acted at the wrong time. Effective decision-making balances structure with intuition. Too much structure paralyzes. Too much intuition without grounding becomes reckless. The sniper's success came from instincts refined through repetition, not guesswork. The final, and perhaps most profound lesson, is about survival itself. The war revealed that survival is not heroic. It is not cinematic. It is quiet, often lonely, and frequently misunderstood. Those who survived did not see themselves as exceptional. They saw themselves as careful. In a culture that celebrates boldness, this lesson is deeply countercultural. Yet history consistently rewards those who prioritize longevity over spectacle. Whether in war, careers, or life, survival enables all future success. The hook that began with disappearing patrols ends with the truth that applies far beyond the battlefield. Mastery is not loud. Advantage does not always announce itself. And the most dangerous people in any system are often the ones who refuse to be seen. World War II's deadliest snipers were not anomalies. They were case studies in how humans interact with environment, risk, and patience. Their legacy is not found in numbers alone, but in the principles they demonstrated under the harshest conditions imaginable. They remind us that the deepest skills are often learned far from institutions, that restraint can be more powerful than force, and that survival belongs to those who understand when not to act. In the end, the war did not make them predators. It merely revealed what they already were. The story of the deadliest snipers of World War II is not merely a collection of extraordinary kill counts or dramatic wartime anecdotes. It is, at its core, a lesson about human behavior under extreme pressure, about how individuals adapt to hostile environments, and about why some people survive where others perish. When examined carefully, the lives and actions of these men reveal principles that extend far beyond warfare, touching on psychology, learning, leadership, resilience, and the limits of systems built on rigid rules. The first lesson is that mastery begins long before formal training. The snipers, who dominated their battlefields were not shaped primarily by military institutions. They were shaped by years of living in environments that punished mistakes without mercy. As hunters, farmers, shepherds, and woodsmen, they learned early that impatience had consequences. If you moved too quickly, the animal fled. If you made noise, the opportunity vanished. If you misjudged weather or terrain, you suffered physically. These lessons were not abstract. They were reinforced daily by hunger, cold, and survival itself. By the time these men entered the army, their minds were already conditioned to think in terms of observation, restraint, and long-term outcomes. This exposes a fundamental weakness in how modern systems often think about training. Institutions assume that enough instruction, repetition, and standardization can manufacture expertise quickly. World War II showed that this assumption has limits. Some forms of competence are not easily compressed into courses or manuals. You can teach a man how to shoot accurately, but you cannot quickly teach him how to be comfortable doing nothing for hours, trusting that patience will eventually pay off. That capacity is psychological, not technical, and it is built over time through lived experience. Another central lesson is the power of restraint. Military culture, especially during total war, often emphasizes aggression, initiative, and constant action. Yet the most successful snipers were defined not by what they did, but by what they refused to do. They refused to fire when conditions were imperfect. They refused to stay in a position simply because doctrine suggested they should. They refused to chase kills or respond emotionally to pressure. Their discipline manifested as self-control rather than obedience. This runs counter to many modern assumptions about productivity and success. In most systems, action is rewarded more visibly than inaction. Doing something feels safer than waiting. Yet these snipers understood that every action increased risk. Each shot created noise, heat, trace, and attention. By limiting action, they limited exposure. Their success was cumulative, built slowly through dozens of decisions not to act. This lesson applies broadly. In complex, high-risk environments, restraint often outperforms aggression, even if it looks inefficient in the short term. Closely tied to restraint is the lesson of environment. These men did not treat terrain and weather as obstacles to be overcome. They treated them as partners. Snow, cold, wind, forests, ruins, and darkness were not inconveniences. They were tools. Hunters learned that the environment is always active, always shaping behavior. Animals move differently in wind. Sound travels differently in cold air. Light changes everything. The snipers carried this understanding into war. They did not fight the environment. They aligned with it. This stands in contrast to doctrinal thinking, which often assumes that technology and coordination can neutralize environmental factors. World War II demonstrated repeatedly that this belief is flawed. The environment always has the final vote. Those who ignore it pay a price. This principle extends beyond combat. In business, politics, or personal life, context shapes outcomes more powerfully than abstract plans. Strategies that ignore context fail regardless of how well they are designed. Another lesson emerges from the way these snipers avoided patterns. Human beings crave predictability, especially under stress. We search for routines, rhythms, and symmetry because they make the world feel manageable. Counter-sniper units assumed their enemies would behave logically within known frameworks. They expected repetition. The hunters deliberately denied it. They changed positions constantly. They avoided schedules. They refused to return to the same place, even if it had been successful. This highlights a broader truth. Predictability creates vulnerability. Systems that rely too heavily on routine invite exploitation. Flexibility and unpredictability, while uncomfortable, provide protection. This is true in warfare, but also in competitive environments where opponents actively study behavior. The snipers survived because they understood how the human mind searches for patterns and exploited that tendency by offering none. The concept of ownership versus control offers another powerful lesson. Military snipers were assigned sectors. They operated within defined boundaries. Hunters owned terrain. Ownership implies deep familiarity. It means knowing not just where something is, but how it behaves over time. These men knew where soldiers would pause, where officers would stand, where sound carried, where light betrayed movement. That knowledge could not be transferred through maps or briefings. It came from time spent living in similar environments. This distinction matters far beyond the battlefield. Leaders often attempt to control systems they barely understand. Those closest to the ground often possess knowledge that formal authority lacks. Ignoring that knowledge in favor of rigid oversight weakens systems. The war showed that localized understanding often outperforms centralized control. Survival rates among these snipers also reveal a lesson about ego. Many trained snipers died because they stayed too long, fired too often, or tried to prove themselves. The hunters had no interest in recognition. Their goal was invisibility. Ego pushes people toward exposure. Humility keeps them alive. This principle applies wherever visibility is confused with value. The most effective contributors are often the least visible. Fear itself becomes a lesson. Conventional weapons create visible danger. Snipers created invisible danger. The uncertainty they generated altered behavior more effectively than direct force. Soldiers moved differently. Leaders hesitated. Entire sectors slowed down. This demonstrates the power of psychological impact. Fear of the unseen reshapes behavior more deeply than fear of known threats. This lesson extends into deterrence, competition, and negotiation. Perception often matters more than action. An unseen capability can have disproportionate influence. The snipers changed behavior not through volume of fire, but through uncertainty. Technology provides another important lesson. Advanced optics, complex mechanisms, and precision equipment did not guarantee success. In many cases, they increased vulnerability. Scopes reflected light. Mechanisms froze or jammed. Simplicity proved more reliable. Tools that worked under extreme conditions outperformed tools that looked superior on paper. This challenges modern faith in technological solutions. Tools are only as good as their alignment with environment and human limitations. When technology adds fragility, it becomes a liability. Robustness often matters more than sophistication. Learning and feedback form another lesson. Hunters learn directly from outcomes. Military systems often buffer feedback through hierarchy and delay. This disconnect allows mistakes to persist. The sniper's effectiveness came from immediate feedback loops. Mistakes were felt instantly. That sharpened judgment. Organizations that separate decision makers from consequences tend to repeat errors. Systems that provide fast, honest feedback adapt more effectively. The war made this painfully clear. The way these men were remembered reveals lessons about history and narrative. Many of the most effective snipers were forgotten because they died early, belonged to minority groups, or did not fit propaganda needs. Survivors were selectively elevated. History is shaped by power and narrative, not just facts. Understanding the past requires skepticism toward simplified stories. Resilience is another central lesson. These men endured conditions that broke others because hardship was not new to them. Comfort does not prepare people for crisis. Gradual exposure does. This does not glorify suffering, but it does recognize that resilience is built through experience, not theory. Decision-making under pressure also emerges as a theme. Hunters trusted instincts refined over time rather than rigid rules. Military snipers constrained by doctrine often hesitated or acted at the wrong time. Effective judgment balances structure with intuition. Too much structure paralyzes. Too little invites chaos. The final lesson is about survival itself. Survival is not heroic or dramatic. It is quiet, lonely, and often misunderstood. Those who survived did not see themselves as exceptional. They saw themselves as careful. In cultures that celebrate boldness, this lesson is uncomfortable, yet survival enables all future success. The story that began with disappearing patrols ends with a universal truth. Mastery is rarely loud. Advantage does not announce itself. And the most dangerous individuals in any system are often the ones who refuse to be seen. The deadliest snipers of World War II were not anomalies. They were case studies in patience, adaptation, and humility under extreme conditions. Their lessons remain relevant wherever humans face uncertainty, competition, and risk. They remind us that some skills cannot be rushed, that restraint can be more powerful than action, and that survival often belongs to those who understand when not to move. In the end, war did not turn these men into predators. It simply revealed what they already were. The story of the deadliest snipers of World War II offers a long, quiet lesson that goes far beyond rifles, battlefields, or kill counts. At its core, it is a study of human behavior under extreme pressure, of how some individuals adapt to hostile environments while others are consumed by them. These men did not survive because they were fearless, stronger, or more loyal than their peers. They survived because they understood something fundamental about patience, restraint, and the limits of control. The first lesson is that true mastery rarely begins with formal training. The snipers who dominated the forests, ruins, and frozen plains of the war were shaped long before they wore uniforms. As farmers, hunters, shepherds, and woodsmen, they grew up in environments where mistakes had immediate consequences. When you hunt to eat, there is no instructor to correct you, no second attempt guaranteed. Move too quickly and the animal escapes. Make noise and the day is lost. Misjudge weather or terrain and you suffer physically. Over time, this creates a mindset rooted in caution, observation, and long-term thinking. By the time these men entered the war, their instincts were already aligned with survival. This exposes a weakness in how large systems think about competence. Modern institutions often believe expertise can be produced quickly through standardized training. World War II showed that some forms of skill resist mass production. Marksmanship can be taught in weeks, but comfort with waiting, with silence, with uncertainty cannot. Those traits require time and experience. They are psychological muscles built slowly, often outside formal structures. Another major lesson is the power of restraint. Military culture frequently rewards action, decisiveness, and aggression. Yet the most successful snipers were defined by what they chose not to do. They did not fire simply because a target appeared. They did not remain in a position because doctrine assigned it. They did not pursue kills to satisfy expectations. Each action carried risk, and they treated risk as something to be minimized, not embraced. Their discipline expressed itself as self-control rather than obedience. This challenges a deep assumption in many areas of life, that doing more leads to success. In reality, these snipers survived because they did less. Less movement, less noise, fewer shots. Each restraint reduced exposure. Their effectiveness was cumulative, built over time through patience. In high-risk environments, restraint is not weakness, it is strategy. Closely connected is the lesson of environment. These men did not see terrain and weather as obstacles, they saw them as active forces. Snow muffled sound but revealed footprints. Cold froze weapons but also punished careless movement. Forests hid motion but carried noise. Urban ruins created cover and traps at the same time. Hunters understand that environment shapes behavior. On the battlefield, soldiers under stress behave predictably, just like wounded animals. The snipers did not fight against these realities. They used them. This lesson applies far beyond war. In any complex system, context matters more than plans. Strategies that ignore environment, culture, or conditions fail regardless of how elegant they appear. Adaptation consistently outperforms rigid design. Another lesson emerges from how these snipers avoided patterns. Humans seek order under stress. We look for routines and symmetry because they provide psychological comfort. Counter-sniper units expected their enemy to repeat behavior, to return to successful positions, to operate within logic they understood. The hunters denied them this. They avoided routines deliberately. They changed positions, timing, and methods. They understood that predictability invites destruction. The broader lesson is simple but uncomfortable. Predictability is vulnerability. Whether in warfare, competition, or daily life, repeated behavior becomes exploitable. Flexibility and unpredictability, though unsettling, provide protection. The difference between ownership and control offers another insight. Military snipers were assigned sectors. They operated within boundaries defined by command. Hunters owned terrain. Ownership means deep familiarity. It means knowing not just where something is, but how it behaves over time. These men knew where soldiers would slow down, where officers would stand, where sound carried farther, where light betrayed movement. This knowledge came from lived experience, not maps. In organizations, leaders often attempt to control systems they barely understand. Those closest to the ground often hold knowledge that formal authority lacks. Ignoring that knowledge weakens any system. The war showed that local understanding often outperforms centralized control. Survival rates also reveal a lesson about ego. Many trained snipers died because they stayed too long, fired too often, or tried to prove themselves. The hunters had no interest in recognition. They wanted invisibility. Ego drives exposure. Humility preserves life. This lesson remains relevant in cultures that reward visibility over substance.